Hello there, my name is Katie Morgan. I am an indie fantasy author and anime aficionado, and welcome to another episode of Let's Write With, the series where we use the power of anime to become better writers. If you're the type of writer who wants to go beyond bulleted lists of things you should always do or things you should never do, then you're in the right place. In this series, we take a more organic approach to writing advice by looking at what other writers are doing and stealing their good ideas and figuring out how to hopefully avoid their mistakes. And if you're interested in the anime Hunter x Hunter, you're also in the right place because that's what we're going to be talking about today. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the anime version of Hunter x Hunter, primarily the 2011 reboot, although I'll be talking a little bit about the original 1999 series as well. I will not be covering the manga, but between the two versions of the anime, we have about 200 episodes to cover, so I think we'll keep plenty busy. With this much story happening, there's no way I'm going to be able to cover every little detail, but just to be safe, here's your blanket spoiler warning for both versions of the anime. I also want to touch on something here at the top of the video that I'll talk a little bit more about later on, and that has to do with the tone of the show. On the surface, Hunter x Hunter looks like it's going to be a fairly typical, fairly light shounen romp, but it is very much not that, or at least it's not only that. The show actually gets very dark and very violent at times. I'm not going to be showing any R-rated clips or anything, but I did just want to give you a heads up that the show does deal with some pretty heavy themes, including abuse and trauma, so please make sure you're in a good headspace for that before you watch either this video or the show. Alright, now that that's out of the way, let's get into the story. Hunter x Hunter is an ongoing shonen manga by Yoshihiro Togashi that began its run in 1998. It was first adapted into an anime in 1999, then rebooted in 2011, now covering several additional story arcs. Hunter x Hunter is the story of Gon, a 12-year-old country boy who decides to follow in his absent father's footsteps and become a hunter. Hunters are basically adventurers who travel the world doing fun, treacherous things like exploring uncharted areas, cataloging magical creatures, and hunting down criminals. Gon wants to understand what drew his dad to become a hunter. He also thinks he might have a chance of actually finding his dad in the long run if he can put together enough clues. Gon's journey leads him to the hunter exam, during which he's faced with a series of dangerous tests that introduces him to both friends and enemies. And as his adventures continue, he begins to realize that the world is much larger and much more complicated than he originally thought, which means that even if he passes the exam and becomes a hunter, there's no guarantee he'll be able to survive what awaits him afterward. In this video, we're going to look at 3 different story elements and try to figure out where they're working, where they're not working, and what we can take away to help with our own writing. The elements we're going to address are party balance, tone, and catharsis. Party balance. If you've ever played a video game or a tabletop RPG, you're probably familiar with the idea of party balance. In order to beat the challenges of the game, you want characters who fulfill a variety of helpful roles: your fighters, your healers, your rogues, and so on. In fiction, party balance is really important too. You want to think about what narrative role each character fills, and you want to make sure that you have the right characters to tell your story. In shonen anime, this often looks like a main trio. The trio. A shonen trio is usually made up of the protagonist and 2 supporting characters with very different personalities and narrative roles. The idea is to create a team of people who both challenge and support each other, which gives you some really good opportunities for both character development and conflict. This initially seems to be the vibe that Hunter x Hunter is going for based on the first few episodes. Gon is our cheerful, idealistic hero. He's friendly, kind, and just headstrong enough to get himself into trouble. He is not always an intellectual powerhouse, but he's determined and willing to stick with any problem until it gets solved, particularly if it involves helping the people he cares about. Gon tends to lead with his heart rather than his head, which can make for some seriously dangerous and reckless behavior if his back's against the wall. On the way to the hunter exam, Gon quickly meets the rest of the trio. Kurapika is the reserved, level-headed smart guy. He can be incredibly intuitive and empathetic, but he also has some serious inner rage issues based on the fact that he is the sole survivor of a massacre that wiped out his entire clan. His reason for becoming a hunter is to get the skills and connections he needs to take revenge on the Phantom Troop, the bandits who killed his family. So while his function within the trio is to be the comparatively stoic brains of the operation, he's also frequently only a few steps away from losing his cool. Leorio is the brash comedic relief. At first, it seems like he's only interested in becoming a hunter for the money, but his apparent shallowness is really just him being cagey about wanting to use hunter financial resources to pay for med school so he can become a doctor and help people who can't afford medical attention. This is, of course, related to past trauma involving a friend he couldn't save. Leorio is arguably the weakest of the trio in terms of abilities, but he serves as the emotional center of the team, reminding everyone of what really matters, often in the loudest, most ridiculous way possible. As you might expect, these personalities clash almost immediately. Kurapika and Leorio irritate each other right off the bat in episode 1, leading them to get into a fight in the middle of a storm at sea. However, when a crew member falls overboard, they immediately drop what they're doing to help Gon save the guy, a feat none of them could have accomplished on their own. And thus the traditional shounen trio is born. Despite the rocky start, there are plenty of situations, particularly during the Hunter exam, that show how well these three work together. For example, in episode 2, the boys are on their way to the main location of the Hunter exam when they're waylaid by a mysterious old woman who refuses to let them pass unless they solve a riddle. Gon plays peacemaker, stopping the others from bickering and admonishing everyone to work together. Leorio immediately points out the unfairness of the riddle they're given and threatens to take action. Kurapika is, of course, the one who figures out what's going on and comes up with a solution. And as the story progresses, there are clear indications that the trio really care about each other too. In the 4th phase of the Hunter exam, examinees are each given a target, another examinee whose badge they have to steal in order to pass. There are other ways to pass, but this is the primary one. In episode 17, Leorio decides to enter a cave by himself to find his target. Because it looks like it might be dangerous, he tells Gon and Kurapika to split. Of course, Gon and Kurapika do nothing of the sort. In fact, when they hear Leorio yelling not long after, they race right in and get themselves caught up in a dangerous situation made even worse by the fact that Leorio's life hangs in the balance. There's no question here that saving him matters more to his friends than potentially failing the exam. Luckily, Kurapika's ability to assess the situation, combined with Gon's bravery and ridiculously enormous lung capacity, saved the day. Thing is, though, Hunter x Hunter isn't really about a trio, because there are actually 4 main characters. The +1. You'd think having an even number of MCs would make the party more balanced rather than less, but you'd be wrong. Now, before the fandom murders me, let me just clarify that Killua is a wonderful character, one of my favorites in the series. But in terms of party balance, I think he causes a few problems. Killua is officially introduced in episode 4 as a punk kid riding a skateboard during the 1st phase of the Hunter exam. He and Gon hit it off almost immediately, probably because they're both about the same age and have the same level of relentless determination, even if their personalities and backgrounds are quite different. Because Killua, as it turns out, is from a family of notorious assassins, and he's taking the exam not so much because he cares about being a hunter, but because he's tired of being a killer and wants to try something different. Personality-wise, he vacillates between snarky rudeness and awkward kindness. And while he's been deeply scarred by his abusive family, his upbringing has made him strategic and extremely powerful, and therefore a valuable addition to the team. There are 2 reasons why I say Killua upsets the established party balance. In terms of narrative roles, he kind of makes Leorio and Kurapika redundant, and because he doesn't have any close relationships with anyone other than Gon, it sort of prevents the team from coming together as a cohesive whole. Let me dig into those things a little bit more so you can see what I mean. Narrative role. Killua is an extremely efficient strategist and a powerful fighter, and those skills only get stronger as the series progresses. His ability to dispassionately assess a situation makes him a good foil for Gon, who is often more impetuous and hot-headed. Killua has his outbursts of anger, and he certainly does his fair share of suffering based on his past, but for the most part, he's the mature one in the room. And if all of that sounds familiar, it's because I could just as easily be describing Kurapika's narrative role as opposed to Killua's. Killua also has a mischievous, rebellious streak and isn't afraid to call out others on their hypocrisy. He's easily bored, frequently argumentative, and doesn't respect people who don't put in the effort. However, as he softens a bit over the course of the series, we get to see more of his ability to provide emotional support for other characters, particularly Gon. And if all of that sounds familiar, it's because I could just as easily be describing Leorio's narrative function as opposed to Killua's. Killua's overall personality and background are different from Kurapika's and Leorio's, of course, but in terms of his role within the group, he kind of doubles up on a lot of what was already there in the original trio. So it's no surprise that his arrival leads to a redistribution of the cast into a main duo, Gon and Killua, and to supporting and often sideline characters, Kurapika and Leorio. Relationship status. Now, in some ways, this division makes sense given the ages of the characters. Gon and Killua are both about 12 when the series starts, Kurapika is 17, and Leorio is 19. I don't know about you, but I don't remember having a whole lot in common with 12-year-olds when I was 17 or 19 and vice versa, so it kind of makes sense to me that Gon and Killua would be closer to each other than they are to the older boys. However, from a writing perspective, this new party arrangement is kind of frustrating because it limits the amount of time that the group can spend bonding and playing off of each other's strengths and weaknesses. Because Killua basically never forms a close connection with either of the older boys. There's even a joke in episode 25 where he pretends not to remember their names. At least, I assume he's pretending. This makes the team a bit lopsided and frankly unrealistic. I mean, in real life, if you hang out with a group of people, you probably have your relationship with each individual person and your relationship with the group as a whole. So in fiction, if we're missing one of those elements, it can make the party seem pretty unbalanced. Now don't get me wrong, I could watch Gon and Killua be adorable together all day, but I can't help but feel that the cast would be a lot more balanced if we saw that all four boys had multifaceted relationships with each other. Because they don't, the narrative has no problem separating them for extended periods of time. Like, very extended. Breaking up is hard to do. It's pretty common for shounen storylines to break up the main cast into smaller groups for short periods of time. But there's really no getting around the fact that after the Hunter exam, Gon and Killua basically become the main characters of the show, while Kurapika and Leorio are demoted to occasional supporting characters. And yes, I know the York New arc is an exception, we'll get back to that. To give you an idea of how this pans out, the 2011 version of Hunter x Hunter covers 7 story arcs. Gon and Killua are central figures in all 7. You could argue that Gon gets sidelined a little in the last arc, but that's temporary, and he's still a huge motivating factor for the other characters. Kurapika and Leorio are central characters in 3, with Leorio appearing as a support character in an additional 1. Neither are present or even mentioned for the longest arc of the series. Now, splitting up your MCs can be a really good way of building tension, but you run the risk of your audience getting annoyed having to wait around for their faves to reappear. And if your readers aren't equally engaged in every plotline, they may get tired and stop waiting around for what they consider to be the good part. Then there's the danger of a character's conspicuous absence making them look bad and even reversing hard-earned character development. Like, say, when the guy who has supposedly learned to prioritize his friends rather than isolating himself is somehow mysteriously not available when one of his friends is in crisis. I mean, if Kurapika were actively in the middle of doing something for his personal quest, that would be understandable. But if all he's doing is just sitting around in the dark looking awesome, he could probably stand to take a break for 2 seconds and answer his goddamn phone. Anyway, my point here is that it's important to consider party balance not just in terms of the characters' personalities and skills, but also in terms of how much time we spend with each of them and why. Obviously, you're going to have main characters and supporting characters, and we'll spend a different amount of time with each. But if you convince your audience that certain characters are important and then leave them out of the story for extended periods of time, you're basically going back on your promise that these characters matter. And breaking a promise to your readers is never a good idea. An important aside. Slightly tangential but important concluding point here, if you want to make sure that your cast is really balanced, you might want to consider not making them all men. There are initially very few women in this show, and while that does get better over the course of the series, it's still really noticeable early on. And it doesn't help that the women we do get are usually minor characters or people whose story revolves around a man. For example, Gon's Aunt Mito exists primarily to provide Gon with info on his dad. Otherwise, she vacillates between being supportive of him and holding him back out of fear for his safety. Kurapika's coworker Melody has an intriguing personal goal to track down a cursed music score at the auction Kurapika is infiltrating during the York New arc. But that plotline is never resolved, and Melody mostly just acts as the voice of reason and support for Kurapika during his conflict with the Phantom Troop. In the Chimera Ant arc, Komugi's main narrative purposes are to humanize the Chimera Ant King and to act as a pawn in the conflict between the Hunters and the Chimera Ants. While she does have an interesting backstory as a game champion, she straight up says her true purpose in life is to share the king's fate at the end of the arc, which is exactly what she does. To be fair, this isn't necessarily a problem with all of the female characters. One arguable exception is Bisuke, Gon and Killua's trainer starting with the Greed Island arc. Her storyline does revolve around men, i.e. helping the male MCs get stronger, but she sort of has her own reasons for doing so, and she gets a fair amount of respect in her own right. But compare these goals and motivations to those of the men in the series, which tend to have to do with things like personal autonomy, justice, and giving back to your community. Or in the case of Hisoka, just being a weirdo who likes fighting people way too much. All I'm saying is, if you want to create a balanced cast, it's worth it to consider how gender might affect that balance. If you find that you're giving all of your characters of one gender the same kinds of goals and motivations, it's probably time to go back to the drawing board. Writing takeaways on party balance. 1. Stories need characters with diverse personalities and skills who both irritate and support each other. This balance is how you get great opportunities for both conflict and character development. 2. If you set up certain characters as central to your story, it's important to make sure you follow through on that promise and provide them with the appropriate amount of time to develop relationships with each other and to grow individually. I mean, I'm not going to say you can never subvert this reader expectation, but I'd be really careful about it. 3. Consider the pros and cons of separating your main party at different points during the story. Distance can make the heart grow fond, but it can also potentially annoy readers who aren't as interested in one character or plotline as they are in another. Tone. So here's where Hunter x Hunter gets kind of weird. For better or for worse, the show basically changes genre and consequently tone with each new story arc, thus my warning earlier about unexpected darkness and violence. I've honestly never seen a show do something quite like this, so I thought we should talk about it. Choose your own genre. Let's do a quick overview of the elements in each arc so you can see what I mean. Hunter Exam Arc. The first story arc of the show follows Gon, Killua, Kurapika, and Leorio as they tackle the various phases of the Hunter Exam. This arc is a pretty typical shounen action-adventure with tests, battles, and teamwork. There are definitely darker elements, particularly with regard to Killua's backstory and, like, Hisoka's entire existence, but even taking all that into account, this arc is fairly light in tone. Zoldyck Arc. Post-exam, Gon, Kurapika, and Leorio travel to the Zoldyck estate to track down Killua and attempt to rescue him from his abusive family. Here we've got a little more emphasis on darker family drama and overt violence in addition to adventure, tests, humor, and camaraderie. Heaven's Arena Arc. After reuniting with Killua, the gang splits up and Gon and Killua go to Heaven's Arena to train and earn some cash. While battling increasingly difficult opponents in arena-style fights, the boys learn about Nen, a technique that allows hunters to manipulate their aura and gain powerful new skills. This arc sits squarely in the battle anime genre and focuses primarily on training and one-on-one fights. Yorknew Arc. 6-ish months post-Hunter Exam, Kurapika gets a job as a bodyguard with a mafia family in order to infiltrate an underground auction where he hopes to run into the bandits who murdered his clan. He's also trying to track down the Scarlet Eyes, literally his clan's red eyeballs, which were removed after their deaths and sold on the black market. As you can probably guess from that summary, this arc lives mostly in the revenge/psychological thriller category and is far darker and more violent than earlier arcs. Greed Island Arc. After securing access through their own participation in the Yorknew auction, Gon and Killua enter the Greed Island video game, which was created by Gon's dad. Inside the game, the boys learn that a group of players is doing everything they can to win the game by killing off everyone else. This arc is basically isekai, a genre in which characters are sucked into another world, often a video game. It also includes training elements and a sports sequence involving the most intense dodgeball game of all time. Chimera Ant Arc. After beating Greed Island, Gon and Killua meet Kite, a student of Gon's dad, and join him on an expedition looking into the appearance of chimera ants in a remote country. The chimera ants are a dangerous, quickly replicating species who are very interested in wiping out humanity, and facing them has catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. This is the longest and most violent arc in the series, and it includes a wide variety of elements, such as action-adventure, war and politics, and lots of one-on-one fights. It also addresses some very complicated philosophical themes. 13th Hunter Chairman Election Arc. In the final arc of the 2011 adaptation, we get two main plotlines. In one, the Hunter Association is trying to elect a new chairman under a cloud of political intrigue. In the other, Killua tries to save his younger sister from their family so she can finally have a life of her own, and maybe use her extremely dangerous gift to cure a comatose Gon. This arc provides a balance of politics, family drama, and horror. As you can see, while there is some crossover in terms of genre and structure from story arc to story arc, the tone of the show can really vary widely depending on which part of the story you're in. Which begs the question, why would an author do that? Assuming it's intentional, drastically changing tone gives you the opportunity to use the same characters in very different situations and try out very different writing techniques. It can also be a great way to show character development. For example, the Gon we see drowning in anger and despair during the Chimera Ant arc is very different from the one we first meet fishing on Whale Island and dreaming of taking the Hunter exam. And both of these are different from the Gon we see beginning to heal and move on to the next phase of his life at the end of the series. Sudden tonal shifts can work really well for humor, too. For example, in episode 7, Killua tells Gon about his family in a quiet moment between Hunter exam phases. The dialogue includes both serious moments where Killua shows how frustrated he is about not being able to make his own life choices, and completely over-the-top commentary about how he'd like to become a hunter and collect the bounty on his assassin family. The abrupt shift works here because it highlights the dual nature of Killua's character. He is both a goofy kid and a skilled assassin. Of course, tonal changes can come with some pretty serious pitfalls, too. Your readers may get whiplash if you move too quickly from light and fluffy to dark and dreary. And a reader who thinks they know what kind of story they're getting into may not appreciate having the rug pulled out from under them every time the tone shifts. Stories generally do have tonal shifts that go along with the natural ups and downs of the narrative, but it's important to make sure those are happening organically. And it's important to take into account that essentially changing genres mid-story may be a turnoff for folks who expected the tone of the overall story to stay the same. Writing takeaways on tone. 1. Readers will likely make assumptions early on about what to expect with regard to the tone of your story. If you switch genres or make significant changes in tone, you may confuse or frustrate them. 2. That said, shifts in tone can be opportunities to show character growth and build on the parameters of your world building by introducing new plot points and themes. They can also work really well for humor. 3. Basically, if you're strategic about it, abrupt tonal changes can work in your favor, but it's important to apply them carefully so you don't alienate your readers with awkward and unexpected shifts. Catharsis. The Cambridge Dictionary defines catharsis as the process of releasing strong emotions through a particular activity or experience in a way that helps you understand those emotions. In fiction, when we talk about catharsis, we're basically talking about emotional payoff. Did you set things up in a way that makes sense, and is the payoff logical? Are the consequences of the story interesting, whether or not they're what the reader expected? Catharsis is vital to your reader's ability to understand and enjoy the story. It's their reward for going through all that rising and falling action. Unfortunately, catharsis is sometimes easier said than done. Set 'em up, knock 'em down. Hunter x Hunter really struggles here, and I think it's due at least in part to the fact that both versions of the anime, particularly the 2011 adaptation, are meant to be fairly straight manga adaptations, and the manga isn't finished. At least it isn't as of the time I'm filming this in 2023. This means that a number of character arcs and plot points don't have official conclusions yet, and rather than trying to ad-lib some sort of catharsis, both versions of the anime just sort of leave some things open. I don't think it's just an adaptation issue, though. I also think there were some disappointing writing choices. The problem with unresolved or unsatisfying payoff is that it can cause your readers to lose trust in you as a writer. After all, why should your readers allow themselves to get emotionally invested in your work if you can't be trusted to follow through on your narrative promises? This isn't to say that Hunter x Hunter always drops the ball in this area. There are situations in which it does a great job of providing catharsis. But since I'm still feeling a little sad about it, and I could use some catharsis of my own, we're gonna start with a few key disappointments before we get into the good stuff. Looking for Jing. The search for Jing, Gon's deadbeat dad, is a huge part of the Hunter x Hunter story. It's what initially motivates Gon to become a hunter, and while it's not the main focus of every story arc, it is central to who Gon is as a character. The 1999 and 2011 versions of the anime take a different approach to catharsis here, probably due to the fact that different amounts of manga were available to adapt at the time. Take 1, 1999. We end the 1999 series with the Greed Island arc, during which Gon and Killua learned that even though Jing made the game, ostensibly to train Gon, he had no intention of ever actually meeting up with Gon inside the game or out of it. However, beating Greed Island allows Gon to bring 3 cards from the game back to the real world, where they can be used in the same way they were in-game. This gives Gon the opportunity to use a card to take him directly to Jing. In the last scene of the anime, we see Gon and Killua arrive at a tree near a lake. There's a man who looks an awful lot like Jing sitting there fishing. The man notices their arrival and starts to turn around, and we fade out. Series over. The main problem here is that after 90+ episodes of build-up regarding how important it is to Gon to find his dad, we never actually see them interact. The entire series has been building up to this moment where they meet, and there isn't really much of a moment. Certainly not a cathartic one. Take 2, 2011. The 2011 version basically follows the same story beats as the 1999 version in terms of the Jing and Gon situation up through the end of the Greed Island arc. The main difference is that there was more source material by this time, so we learn that the man that Gon and Killua meet isn't Jing at all, but his student Kite. Right after this meeting in episode 76, we get a flashback of Jing arranging the outcome of the Greed Island game so that if Gon beats it and tries to use a card to find Jing, it will only work if Gon comes alone. If Gon brings a friend, the card will take him to Kite instead, which is what happens since Gon brings Killua along. While the narrative doesn't exactly shy away from showing this as further evidence that Jing is a jerk, the situation is also kind of played for laughs. Sure, it was a mean thing to do, but by golly, isn't Jing just an awkward, cheeky rascal? Gon and Jing do end up meeting eventually, but it's much later in the series. During the 13th Hunter Chairman election arc, the last arc of the 2011 anime, Jing shows up as one of the Zodiac, a group of Hunter Association leaders who are in charge of organizing the election. Over the course of this arc, we learn a little bit more about Jing as a person and as a hunter. He's clearly manipulative, insightful, and clever, and he has zero interest in visiting his comatose son while he's in town. That said, he does tell his political rival that he has faith that Gon will pull through. This is somewhat decent catharsis in that it shows us a lot more about who Jing is as a person and why he acts the way he does. However, the most cathartic element of the Jing and Gon plotline here is the scene in episode 141 where Leorio, furious that Jing hasn't bothered to check on Gon, takes the opportunity to use Nen to punch Jing in the face. Okay, maybe it's not cathartic in the writerly sense of resolving character arcs or plot points, but it's still basically one of the best things Leorio does in the entire series. The actual plot and character payoff comes in 2 parts. In episode 146, thanks to Killua's efforts, Gon regains consciousness and finds Jing in the auditorium in the middle of another vote. Here, Gon talks to Jing for the first time. And when I say talk, I mean he bursts into tears and apologizes for having had a hand in Kite's death during the Chimera Ant debacle. It's cute and funny how over-the-top Gon gets while trying to explain the entire Chimera Ant arc to Jing in one go, but it also kind of diffuses the importance of the moment by focusing on the humor rather than the weight of Gon finally finding his dad. That said, there are parts of this conversation where Jing actually acts like a father and reassures Gon, including giving him some pretty decent advice about how to deal with mistakes. But then it's right back to Jing trying to get out of taking responsibility as a parent, which is again played for laughs. And while Jing does reluctantly agree to talk later, he then makes sure to book it as soon as possible, leaving only a somewhat cryptic note behind. Luckily, this isn't the end of the catharsis in this version. In episode 148, the last episode of the series, Gon tracks Jing down at the World Tree, where the two finally have a real chat, and Jing manages again to act moderately father-like. I mean, it might have been nice if they talked about how Gon really feels about having been abandoned, but the narrative is kind of already established that Gon's not super upset about that, so it kind of makes sense that it might just never come up, even if the audience feels a little bit more strongly about it than Gon does. Overall, the 2011 version does provide us with a little more catharsis on this plot point, but there's still one fairly large issue. Back in episode 76, Kite made a point of explaining that finding Jing was his last test as Jing's apprentice, and it took significant time and effort to do it. However, when Gon ultimately catches up with Jing, it's not because of any action he takes, it's just because they happen to be in the same place at the same time. I suppose you could argue that becoming a hunter was the action, but in terms of what Gon does to make the actual meeting happen, it's mostly just luck. And from a writing perspective, that's a pretty big letdown. It is cathartic to see Jing and Gon interact, but it still kind of feels like a bit of a cop-out given how we got there. Looking for assassins. One of Killua's main storylines has to do with his tumultuous relationship with his family. This is something that runs through the entire series, but it's particularly important during the second story arc. Killua's most abusive and destructive relationship is arguably the one he has with his older brother Illumi. Illumi trained Killua to be an assassin, and his manipulation has had a huge effect on how Killua functions, both as a person and as a fighter. Illumi is also the reason Killua initially fails the hunter exam and decides to return home to his family's estate. While Kurapika and Leorio aren't able to prove it to Chairman Netero, it's pretty clear that Illumi manipulates Killua into killing a fellow examinee, which leads to Killua's disqualification. Once Gon learns what happened, he demands that Illumi tell him where Killua is and flat out says he's going to save Killua from his family. Which is exactly what he, Kurapika, and Leorio then set out to do. The build-up for this arc is done really well. Killua has been set up as snarky, confident, and deadpan, someone with no respect for authority and no problem getting into trouble if he thinks it'll be interesting. But from the moment Killua realizes that one of the examinees was his brother in disguise all along, we see a completely different side of him. He's a scared little kid struggling to keep it together while someone who taught him everything he knows says he's unworthy of friendship or autonomy. The level of threat that Killua is under here makes the stakes seem really high, but the really confusing thing here in terms of Catharsis is the way this arc ultimately plays out, especially given all the buildup. Because while Gon, Kurapika, and Leorio are going through all these trials and tribulations in order to reach Killua, it turns out that Killua never really needed saving. Not that he's been having a fun time while his friends struggle to get to him, but when it comes to actually escaping his family's clutches, his friends' actions don't really matter, because all he had to do was have a chat with his dad. In the 1999 version, this chat starts out just as terrifying as everything else Killua's been through since he got home, if not more so. As with his earlier interactions with Illumi, we see Killua acting uncharacteristically scared and uncomfortable when he's talking to his dad. The dialogue is innocuous enough, Silva just seems interested in catching up with his kid, but Killua's body language and hesitation convey a lot more than the words being said. It's a really great scene, one that I would argue is a little bit more fraught and complex than the one we get in the 2011 version, even though what actually happens is pretty similar. And here's what happens. Silva asks about Killua's experiences in the Hunter exam. Killua tells him about Gon, clearly showing delight at having a friend for the first time. Silva models excellent active listening skills, then tells Killua he's free to live his life as he chooses, so long as he promises never to betray his friends. And then Killua leaves. After all that build-up, after everything Gon and the others have gone through to get to him, Killua just walks out. To be fair, there is a brief scene afterward that seems to imply that it was all an act on Silva's part, and he doesn't actually intend to allow Killua to leave the family. But the fact that Killua shows no indication of being suspicious of his father's actions, and the fact that this is basically never addressed again, sure does make it seem like the payoff for all that buildup was zilch. There's no real rescue here, and there's no sense that any specific action Gon and the others take has anything to do with Killua's release. It's not even clear what Killua does to get his freedom. It kind of just seems like it's on his dad's whim. All that buildup, no clear payoff. Looking for spiders. Kurapika's revenge plotline during the Yorknu arc has some really good, smaller moments of buildup and payoff, but in terms of overall catharsis, there are two fairly large issues. Achievement unlocked? The biggest issue here has to do with the question of whether or not Kurapika actually gets his revenge, and the answer is We've known since episode 1 that revenge is Kurapika's main motivation for becoming a hunter. This is sometimes shown at the expense of his usual composure, like in episode 9 when he thoroughly trounces a guy who has what appears to be a spider tattoo, the same kind the Phantom Troop have. Later episodes build on this, adding an increasingly self-destructive element. Like Gon and Killua, Kurapika learns to use Nen very quickly. However, in his case, he focuses on using his new power to design a weapon that ties directly into his need for revenge. The chain he creates has a variety of abilities, but the most powerful one, the one he intends to use against the Phantom Troop, will literally kill him if he uses it incorrectly. In a not terribly subtle conversation with his mentor in episode 39, Kurapika explains that he sees the chain as a form of punishment for the Phantom Troop. His mentor suggests that it really represents a way for Kurapika to chain himself to his trauma. Kurapika takes this about as well as you'd expect. This lead-in to the Yorknu arc suggests that the actual revenge itself, tracking down and killing the Phantom Troop, followed by recovering the Kurta clan's Scarlet Eyes, is going to be hugely important and life-changing for Kurapika. Or, life-ending. The problem with all this great build-up is that the payoff has to be pretty spectacular in order to keep up, which is a problem since there really isn't much payoff. Kurapika does end up killing one of the Phantom Troop members, and his actions lead to the death of another, as well as the complete, but implied to be temporary, incapacitation of the troop's leader, Crollo. However, this leaves most of the Phantom Troop walking away from the Yorknu arc completely unharmed, at least physically, and without having been held accountable for their actions. And it leaves Kurapika walking away without giving the audience a clear sense of whether he's even okay with how things shook out. In the 1999 version, he does seem distressed by this lack of resolution, at least briefly. And in the last several episodes of the arc, we see some indications that he's still struggling to process what he's been through. There's also a scene where he tells Gon that he's moving on to finding the eyes rather than trying to track down the remaining members of the Phantom Troop. Later in the series, Killua calls Kurapika to warn him that Crollo may have found a way to reverse Kurapika's curse and get his Nen back. This is in episode 66 of the 2011 version. However, Kurapika is remarkably uninterested, claiming he already considered that as a possibility, and since the curse hasn't actually been lifted yet, it's all good. And that's it. End of Revenge arc. To be clear, catharsis in this situation doesn't have to mean one result over another. It's not only cathartic if Kurapika kills the entire Phantom Troop, or gets himself killed, or decides he's done with the whole revenge thing and is going to take up macrame instead. It's just that since revenge is the crux of this plotline, we shouldn't have any lingering question regarding whether or not Kurapika achieved his goal. Either he thinks he did, and we get to know how he feels about it, or he thinks he didn't, and we get to know how he feels about that, too. I suppose you could argue that what we get is a third option, where he's not really sure, which would be fine, but there's no clear narrative indication of that. Instead, things just stay really open-ended without any explanation for why Kurapika's priorities shifted, or whether he got any catharsis at all. The power of friendship. There's one more element here that I think is worth discussing, and it's something I alluded to earlier. The narrative sure does want us to think that Kurapika's character arc, at least in part, is about learning to allow himself to rely on other people rather than trying to go it alone. But wow, does the story keep trying to walk that back. One of the big turning points in the York New storyline happens in episode 54, when Kurapika and the gang are officially reunited and start working together on a plan to take down the troop. As a show of faith, Kurapika explains in detail how his chain works, including its limitations. This is extremely dangerous, as Killua points out, since the Phantom Troop has a member who can read people's memories, which means that if any of them get caught now, the troop could easily learn all of Kurapika's weaknesses. Kurapika's not particularly concerned about this, though. He'd rather be open with his friends and make sure they have the information they need to make their plan work. This culminates in the resolution of the hostage situation in episode 58. Kurapika is finally in a position to actually kill Crollo, who led the campaign that wiped out the Kurta clan. But Gon and Killua are in danger, and if Kurapika doesn't make the right call in this moment, the negotiations will break down, and they'll probably die. So he decides to go with his friends' lives over his need for revenge. This seems to be another significant turning point in Kurapika's character arc. As angry as he still is, he values his friends over his need to hurt the people who hurt him. However, when it comes to long-term payoff for Kurapika's character development, the results are not so great. In part, that's because we see very little of him for the rest of the series. And what we do see is a character who's gone right back to where he was at the beginning of this arc, getting into trouble on his own and ignoring his friends. Beyond that brief phone call with Killua in episode 66, Kurapika never interacts with the others again. In fact, he actively avoids them, as we see in episode 140 when Leorio tries to contact him about Gon's critical condition, and Kurapika doesn't answer the phone he is actively holding in his hands, because apparently sitting around in the dark staring at the scarlet eyes he's recovered is more important. Which is, not a good look, especially if you want to maintain the payoff of a character arc. Alright, so there are some places where the catharsis is less apparent, but what about the times when it's spot on? Payback. During the fourth phase of the Hunter exam, when the examinees are assigned targets whose badges they have to steal, Gon has the very bad luck of being assigned Hisoka. Hisoka is, I'm going to say, a creep to keep things PG rated. He is definitely one of the most dangerous people taking the Hunter exam, and his interest in Gon is concerning. He's also much stronger than Gon at this point, which means that it would be impossible for Gon to just fight the guy head on and take his badge. Instead, Gon concocts a plan, a pretty decent plan that plays to his strengths. And it works. Sort of. However, right after stealing Hisoka's badge, Gon is knocked out by a fellow examinee, who is then himself taken out by Hisoka. Rather than waltzing off into the sunset, though, Hisoka decides to leave his badge with Gon, essentially assuring that Gon will pass the test. When Gon protests, Hisoka hits him and says he'll accept the return of the badge once Gon is able to hit him back. This is arguably Gon's first significant failure, and he's clearly mortified and furious about having to pass the test this way. After the completion of this test phase, when everyone is back on the airship, there's a really lovely scene where Gon, who's been hiding all of this from his friends, finally tells Kurapika what happened. The catharsis here is particularly impactful in the 1999 version, where Gon seems far more upset and doesn't recover as quickly as he does in the 2011 version. We see him being really vulnerable and frustrated, but not in an over-the-top kind of way. And it's a nice touch that Gon is still fighting tears when he thanks Kurapika for listening. Both versions of this scene add an emotional weight to the situation with Hisoka, which makes the payoff that much better. Gon's need for resolution is a major motivating factor for his decision to go to Heaven's Arena with Killua to train, and the catharsis of his eventual fight with Hisoka is solid on multiple levels. In episode 35, after a whole lot of training, Gon finally gets his chance to fight Hisoka in an official match. Using his new Nen skills, Gon achieves his goal and, as promised, punches Hisoka in the face. But the more subtle and maybe more impressive payoff is the moment right after, when he hands Hisoka's badge back to him, and Hisoka silently accepts it. It's also worth noting that even though Gon's gotten a lot stronger, he still loses this fight. So the win here isn't what you might expect a win to be. It's the catharsis of proving his worth to his opponent and himself by achieving his goal. Friends. I could talk for hours about the evolution of Gon and Killua's friendship, and in particular its impact on Killua, but this video is already really long, so let's just do a Cliff Notes overview of the situation so you can see how the build-up and payoff work. When Gon and Killua initially hit it off during the first phase of the Hunter exam, it's mostly because they bond over being competitive little dorks who think that this whole running for hours without stopping thing is easy peasy, even with everyone around them dropping like flies. But over the course of the show, their friendship evolves from "this is a funny kid I like to hang out with" to "this is a funny kid I would die for." Whether it's Gon leading the charge to retrieve Killua from his abusive family, or Killua overcoming his brother's brainwashing in order to help Gon, the narrative spends a significant amount of time building up how important this relationship is. And while it's clearly important to both of them, it has a particularly strong impact on the development of Killua's character. As someone who spent his entire childhood focusing only on assassinating targets, Killua is fairly distant with others and doesn't have a lot of experience with just, having friends and hanging out with people. However, during his confrontation with Illumi in episode 20, he admits, under duress, that that's exactly what he's been looking for. The opportunity to just be a normal kid and hang out with Gon. Of course, being a normal kid isn't really on the agenda for a shounen anime character. But over the course of the series, Killua and Gon become nearly inseparable and extremely devoted to each other. While the two have a lot of really great moments throughout the show, the buildup of their relationship really pays off during the Chimera Ant arc. This is when the stakes go up exponentially, and Killua is forced to make some really difficult decisions and to show how much his relationship with Gon has changed him. The first of these decisions is in episode 85, when the Chimera Ant Pitou attacks Kite and the boys. It's clear that Pitou is way too strong for them, but Gon gets ready to fight anyway, and only stops because Killua knocks him out and runs, per Kite's orders. In the past, Killua might have just figured he made the right call and left it at that. Now, however, he realizes how ill-equipped he and Gon are to handle the Chimera Ants at their current power level. And because he's come to understand how important Kite is to Gon, he worries that Gon will be furious with him for leaving Kite behind. However, when Gon wakes up, he's not angry at all. In fact, he's grateful to Killua for getting them out of there. He's also in complete denial regarding Kite's very likely death. This is the beginning of some really interesting and opposing character development that continues throughout the rest of the arc. Because while Gon becomes increasingly desperate and dangerous, Killua becomes the more compassionate one, struggling to keep it together for both of them. And as he continues to level up in the be an awesome friend department, Killua also continues to level up in the figuring himself out department. In episode 86, we get the return of Bisque, the boy's mentor from the Greed Island game. Her training ends up being particularly difficult for Killua, whom she points out has been taught to run away from stronger opponents rather than face them. This, she warns, could result in him abandoning Gon. Faced with the very real possibility of failing his best friend, Killua doubles down on his determination to protect Gon no matter what. This leads to a situation in episode 94 where Killua takes on a dangerous Chimera Ant all by himself in an effort to keep it from reaching Gon. The trouble here is that Killua is still suffering from the effects of Illumi's brainwashing, which means he has to actively push back against his instinct to run away from a clearly more powerful opponent. So when Killua finally wins this fight and attributes it to his need to protect his friend, it's a huge bit of payoff for both his personal development and his relationship with Gon. What Killua goes through here matters, not just because it shows that he's getting stronger, but because it shows that he's finally gotten what he said he wanted all the way back in the Hunter exam arc, namely a life of his own outside of his family, with a friend who's worth fighting for. Revenge. While the overall catharsis for Kurapika's plotline may be a bit disappointing, there are still some solid moments of smaller-term build-up and payoff. After a series of events involving stolen auction goods and murdered bodyguards, Kurapika finally fights his first Phantom Troop member, Uvogin, in episode 47. There's snarky dialogue, cool fight choreography, and a sense that we're finally getting to see some payoff for this revenge thing. As well done as the 2011 version is, I want to give some props to the 1999 version for adding a few things that I think make the payoff here even better. The original version of the fight starts with a tense, quiet moment where we see Kurapika reciting a Kurta prayer before the smackdown begins. The seriousness of it, combined with the moments during the fight where Kurapika completely loses his cool, gives the whole sequence an added layer of dread. And while Kurapika wins the fight, it clearly takes a toll on him. Later, we get another punch to the gut with a follow-up scene in which Kurapika returns to the hotel where he and his fellow bodyguards are staying. He looks absolutely wrecked by his fight with Ivogan. Remember, the fight he won, the fight that was supposed to represent a positive milestone in his carefully plotted revenge. And the scene ends with him praying again, completely alone. We've had plenty of hints, particularly from Kurapika's mentor, that this revenge thing is going to have serious consequences, and now we get to actually see it. I really do like the 2011 version as well, but I'm a little bummed they decided not to keep these extra moments of emotional and narrative payoff. Both versions do agree on a bit of happier catharsis, though. In episode 54 of the 2011 anime, Kurapika meets up with Gon and Killua in the park. The 20-odd seconds of their reunion, which include Gon and Killua being adorable and Kurapika laughing for the first time in like 5,000 episodes, almost make up for the horrible things they've all gone through during this arc. Writing takeaways on catharsis. 1. Satisfying catharsis is about balanced build-up and payoff. If you set up a character or plot point as important, it's vital to follow through on showing why and how it's important. 2. Sometimes catharsis is about the consequences attached to a whole plot arc. Sometimes it's about consequences attached to a small character moment. Be on the lookout for both opportunities. 3. Good catharsis is a way of showing your readers that you can keep your promises as a writer. If you leave them hanging too long, or if you don't provide any resolution at all, your audience may not stick around. Conclusion. So let's review what we've learned today, shall we? 1. When you give your story a variety of characters with different skills and personalities, you're also giving yourself loads of great opportunities for character development and conflict. 2. If you set up a character as being critical to your story, make sure you follow through on that promise and provide them with adequate time to develop both as an individual and in tandem with the rest of the cast. 3. Abrupt shifts in tone may confuse your readers, especially if they go in expecting one type of story and end up with something entirely different. That doesn't mean you should never shift tone, just that you need to be strategic about it. 4. For example, significant tonal shifts can give you the opportunity to show how your characters deal with completely new situations, or to just show them being silly. 5. Providing good catharsis means having a logical balance of build-up and payoff when it comes to things like character arcs and plot points. If it matters, the build-up probably needs to be big, and if the build-up is big, the payoff needs to be big too. 6. There's no one right answer when it comes to catharsis, but you should consider what sort of resolution might be satisfying to your readers versus what sort might just leave them frustrated. Tangent. Just a quick PSA here, if it wasn't obvious from the rest of this video, I really think it's worthwhile to try to get your hands on both versions of the anime. This is particularly true if you want to look at them from the perspective of the writing. There are a fair number of similarities between the two versions, but they also make some very different choices, and it can be really interesting to look at those choices and try to figure out when they work and when they don't work and why. I mention this because I think there's some ill-tempered back and forth in the fandom regarding which version is better, and I think the answer is clearly both. That's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you've seen Hunter x Hunter, I would love to know your thoughts, particularly if you have any thoughts on the writing, so please feel free to put those in the comments below. I'm always open to suggestions for other anime to cover in this series, so please feel free to leave those suggestions as well. And if you'd like to see how I incorporate some of these lessons into my own writing, or if you just happen to like cranky empaths and magical conspiracies, you may want to check out my urban fantasy trilogy, The Compound series. Books 1 and 2 are available in ebook and paperback, and book 3 is on the way. More info on that also below. Thanks again for watching, keep writing, and I'll see you in the next video.